Hello, everyone, and welcome to Monterey's Magical History Tour with historian Tim Thomas. Thank you all for taking some time to join us today. Before we get started, just a couple house rules. Please mute yourself just to try to help limit distractions during the presentation. And then one else also is if any questions do arise, please feel free to put them into the chat box. And I will read them at the end of the presentation, or hold your questions till the very end, where then we'll unmute ourselves and we can have a Q&A with Tim. So with that, Tim, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sean, and welcome everyone to another edition of Monterey's Magical History Tour. Let's see if I can share a screen here. Today's program is a little near and dear to my heart. I've been working with the Monterey Japanese American Citizens League for a number of years. In fact, I've been on their board of directors for well over 10 years now. And I think the history of the Japanese of the Monterey Peninsula is a unique one. How I got to it, and I get that question a lot actually. As many of you who've been to these other programs know that I worked for the Monterey Maritime Museum for a number of years. I was the historian and curator there. And of course, Monterey's real maritime history is her fishing history. And I've been researching the history of the Monterey fisheries for well over 30 years. And the Japanese story is a really important one. In fact, without the Japanese fishermen, really these pioneering Japanese fishermen, the Monterey fishing world would never be what it turned out to be, but due to the fishing technologies they brought with them and the skills they brought with them, all kinds of things. And that's what brought me to the JACL, was to research that story. And I've been there ever since. And so once I got involved with JACL, they, knowing I worked at a museum, their dream was to open a small museum chronicling the story of the Japanese on the Monterey Peninsula. And so they got me involved in that project, which went on for about 10 years. And we finally opened the museum 2 years ago, right before the pandemic hit. And then almost within a couple of weeks, we had to shut it down. And for the last 2 years, it's been closed. We had opened it up periodically for special kind of tours. And we have just recently reopened it. And we are now currently open on the weekends. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on through the tour. So what I'm going to try to do today is give you a little history of the Japanese on the Monterey Peninsula, and also intermix that with sort of a virtual tour of our museum and how we cover some of that. So the photograph you see in front of you is one of my favorite photographs. This was taken in 1925 at an annual picnic of the Japanese community, which is actually, the picnics are still things that still go on actually. And this was taken out of Point Lobos. And this was a special picnic because one of the princes from Japan was visiting Monterey at the time, which wasn't that uncommon actually. They would send emissaries from Japan to come and see how their folks are doing here in California, in Monterey. I love this photograph. It was taken by, of course, A.C. Heydrich. You've all seen a number of Heydrich's photographs. He was famous for those panoramic images of the Monterey area. He also was a guy that the school district hired, and he would take all the class pictures because he had this special pivot on his camera that he had designed that would enable him to make these sort of panoramic images here. And then his wife actually would hand color the things in. You paid extra for that, of course. In fact, you could go and you could buy the photograph from Heydrich, and you would pay an extra $1 to have you colored into the picture. So it wouldn't be uncommon to find some of his photographs where parts of it colored and parts of it were not colored. In fact, we see that in this image. There are some people who are not actually painted in this particular image, but it's a wonderful photograph. In fact, also, this is sort of the beginning of Monterey, the Japanese American Citizens League Hall, which I'll talk about in a minute here. Let's see here. I'm not moving anything. Hang on now for a second here. Yep, there we go. Here's the JACL Hall. This was built in 1926, and they got the initial money, the seed money, like $100 from that prince who came to visit Monterey in 1925. And they used that money, I believe, to buy the property that the building sits on today. And in fact, that's where I am right now. I'm in this building right now. And initially it was built by an organization called the Japanese Association, which is a group of businessmen, mostly men associated with the wharf and the fishing industry. And they built it because they felt they needed to have a building where people could come, and newly arriving immigrants from Japan who could come and sort of assimilate into the United States, into Monterey life, and they would come to this building. Families lived in this building at time to time. They had classes for English. They had, if people had disputes with other community members, they would come into this building where they would sort of try to work that kind of thing out. They had traveling entertainers from Japan would come and they would perform here, famous musicians. They had kabuki theater in here. They had sumo wrestling in here. They had Buddhist temple in here for many, many years. And then they had Japanese school in here, which in early days, Japanese school in the 20s and 30s really was for Nisei children, children who were born of Japanese families, but born in the United States, and they would go to Japanese school after the regular school, where they would learn to continue Japanese tradition, Japanese language, and other kinds of things. We still have Japanese school here on Saturdays, but now it's more of a language school that continue to learn Japanese language. I should point out, too, that this building has been in the hands of the Japanese community since day one. They've always owned that building. So it's all about fishing. That's what brought the Japanese here to Monterey. It was abalone and salmon in particular. By the way, this is the entrance to our museum that we see here. Here's the entrance to our museum here. Let me see if I can do that here. No. So again, all about fishing, and we'll get into that as we go along here. But really, you can see this gentleman here. This is an Auto Sabaru Noda. This is the Japanese Association that I mentioned. This picture was taken about 1908. And if you're any of the hip crowd in our audience today who comes to Monterey and goes to the Captain Stoker's coffee place, that's about where this picture was taken, right on that corner. And there was a house there at that time. And this gentleman you see here, named Auto Sabaru Noda. Noda immigrated to Monterey about 1895, 1896. He actually came to California in the 1880s, initially ending up in Watsonville, and then moved over to work for Spreckles Sugar Plant in Spreckles. And then he moved to Monterey and got a job working for the then land arm of the Southern Pacific Railroad, the Pacific Improvement Company. He was kind of a labor contractor and a gatherer of wood. He's kind of like a lumberjack. So the Pacific Improvement Company owned about 8,000 acres of the Monterey Peninsula at that time. And so he was up on a tree one day near the Monterey Wharf and looked down into the harbor and just saw all this abalone down there. In fact, so much abalone, he literally described it in a letter as being a carpet of abalone, and nobody's doing anything with it. And the reason nobody is doing anything with it because nobody knew what the heck are you supposed to do with it. Unless you're preparing abalone properly, it is kind of like eating a rubber boot. The Japanese, who've been dealing with abalone for centuries, well, they knew what to do with it. So Noda-san writes a letter back to the government of Japan and said, hey, all this abalone here, nobody wants it. The government of Japan sends this guy right here. This is Jinosuke Kidani, who was in the abalone business in the Chiba Prefecture of Japan. He comes over and goes, oh, this is great. He sends back to Japan for abalone divers known as ama or free divers. Here's our ama or free divers. And we actually know who these guys were. We actually have their passports. In between that time, Noda actually went down to present-day Cannery Row and leases a piece of property down there. And if you know the Cannery Row area, there's a big empty lot, big piece of property, an old cannery site there between the El Torito restaurant and another restaurant. It's been in the news a lot lately. In fact, the Coast Week did a big article about it just recently. That's where they want to put a big marketplace there. Well, he leased that piece of property. and then sent back to Japan for other Japanese fishermen and created a little fishing colony on that very site there. So those divers from Japan, came to Monterey, probably around 1897, 1898, were taken down to Noda's camp and got dressed that first morning in their traditional ama gear, which you can see consists of a white cotton outfit here. Here's the abalone basket, abalone pry, pair of goggles, which had pig's bladders on the ends that they would squeeze to help release the pressure. And then they went into the Monterey Bay, jumped into the water, and then about 10 seconds later, they jumped back out and they said, "Oh, Kadani-san, you didn't tell us how cold that water is." There is about a 15-degree water temperature difference between Monterey and Japan, and that is a big difference. I'm not really light of it, and the truth is this was tradition, and there were ama divers like this in Monterey Bay into the 1920s. Here is from our museum exhibit. This is of ama diving. You can see we have a number of gear. Here's a mask, here's some goggles, another mask you see here. You can see this is where they would hook the bladders to it. This mask has leather bladders hooked to it here. Here is the abalone basket here. And this is the white cotton outfit that they would wear, the ama gear you see right here. And then these are actually, I love these. These are actually handmade knitted gloves that are lined in wool. These were actually made here in Monterey. The diver would wear, they'd put it on and they would wear it when they went into the water. They, of course, you couldn't collect abalone when you're wearing these gloves. So they take the gloves off and then they put them back on when they weren't collecting abalone. All right. So this is a site that Noda had leased from and sent for his abalone or his other fishermen. And this is where those divers would have gone off here. So these other fishermen weren't just fishing abalone. They came there fishing salmon, they were fishing rockfish, they were fishing sardine. In fact, in 1902, Noda opened a cannery on this very site, Monterey Fishing Cannon Company. So the very first cannery on present-day Cannery Row, sardine cannery, was Japanese owned by Satoru Noda. He did have an American partner, a guy named Harry Malpass. They operated that cannery until 1907. Here's our ama divers again, and so they weren't just getting abalone. You can see that little rockfish on the end of the stick here. So maybe that's for lunch, we're not sure. So here is a label from the Noda Cannery, Monterey Fishing Cannon Company. This is a really rare label, and I have this on exhibit in our museum. And I found this label actually on eBay. eBay is the museum curator's best friend. I mean, this is a label I thought I would never see. And there's a whole world of people that collect Cannery Row labels. And I was looking on there one day and this popped up and I said, oh my gosh, that's from Noda's Cannery. And I was just stunned when I saw it. And they only had like a price of $10 on it. But it was a auction. So I figured people were going to bid on it. And I was prepared to bid quite a bit of money to get this. And it turns out nobody bid on it. And I got that label for $10. As far as I know, it's the only one that exists. I've never seen one before. So we do have this on exhibit. I'm very happy to have it. So it's you see California sardines cooked in olive oil, a true sardine, right? So sardine really is sort of a generic word for small silvery fish. All small silvery fish are essentially referred to as sardine. In California, they catch what's known as a pilchard or the true sardine, the big guy right there. So it was, I mentioned, not just sardine, but or abalone that brought the Japanese fish, but salmon also was very important. Notice this huge numbers of salmon that would appear in the spring. And so he sent for salmon fishermen that brought technology with them, and they began to fish for salmon in the bay. They were trolling them, which is a line with a lot of hooks on it. They would drag through the water, which is a really effective way to catch salmon out in the bay out there. And to give you an idea of how large this fishery was, this picture you're seeing, it was taken in 1909. At the end of this 1909 salmon season, which lasted 3 months, May 15th to August 15th, the Monterey Daily Cypress, which was the local newspaper at that time, reported at the end of this 1909 salmon season, there were 185 salmon boats working the Monterey Bay. 145 of them were Japanese owned, catching an average of 1 million pounds of king salmon in 3 months. 1 million. The 1909 salmon season, they caught 1,500,000 pounds of king salmon in the Monterey Bay. In 1910, they caught 2 million pounds of king salmon in the Monterey Bay. That is a lot of fish. So here they are unloading some of that king salmon right at work. These are all Japanese fishermen you see in this photograph here. Big salmon. They're going in. By the way, all the salmon wasn't going to a local market. It wasn't even going to the San Francisco markets. It really was going to Europe, mainly going to Germany. That's where the big market was for this in those days. In those days, in the United States, people ate a lot of sardines, but the sardines they were not those big ones that catch out of Monterey Bay, but those little guys that come out of the North Atlantic, coming out of Europe, coming out of France. France was a big sardine producer at the turn of the 20th century. So what happened in the world in 1914? World War I, because of all that salmon going to Europe, all those sardines coming from Europe, and they just switch and begin to heavily fish sardine along the West Coast, and particularly in Monterey. And that's how sardine become the biggest fishery, the single fish in the history of the United States. And I think it all because of these Japanese fishermen catching all the salmon up there. So here is a wonderful photograph that I just recently got. And this is taken about 1915 of a Japanese fisherman at the Monterey Boat Works on his brand new salmon boat. And I love this one image. You see the American flag and the Japanese flag. We're getting ready to launch this boat right here. So one of the projects that we're working on here at JACL is to develop a kind of a sculptural tribute to the Japanese fishermen of Monterey Bay. And this is what we want to do. We want to rebuild this boat and place it along the Monterey waterfront with the American flag and the Japanese flag. Actually, I think it'd make a wonderful sculpture and a wonderful tribute to the Japanese fishermen in Monterey. Don't you all think? Be a great thing. Okay, so as I mentioned, we had AMA in Monterey Bay all into the 1920s. This was a wonderful ad for a 4th of July celebration here in Monterey in 1909, put on by a guy named Manuel Duarte. Duarte family owned a number of businesses along the Monterey waterfront that catered to the tourist trade, fish markets, he had little marine, sort of marine museum, so all kinds of different maritime products like whalebone things and abalone shells, all kinds of things. This is an ad for his 4th of July glass bottom boat rides on his Venetian gondola El Abuso, which means the diver. And for 25 cents, he promises you can see all these wonderful things, all kinds of beautiful marine gardens and colorful sea stars and abalones and whale bones and jellyfish and all kinds of things. But down here he says, I've also engaged the celebrated Japanese diver, Casey Ko, I think he misspelled his name, who will dive for the boat in his native costume, he'll be AMA style, and get anything the passenger may desire. Also in action at the bottom of the bay, we'll place the glass over him and you get a good view of his wonderful work and endurance. Now, wouldn't that have been a cool thing to see? That would have been something. So here around, as I mentioned, the water was cold and by the turn of the 20th century, they were switching to this helmet diving gear. It was far more efficient. That's really the main reason they went to the helmet gear. Because with the helmet gear, you can stay underwater for hours at a time, whereas the diver, the AMA divers are down 2-3 minutes. Some of those AMA divers could hold their breath for 3 minutes, but you're going back and forth. In fact, the AMA would work in pairs on a boat, and usually had a barrel in the middle of the boat, which had a fire going all the time. And then when they're diving, one diver would have a rope tied around his waist that went through a pulley system. They go into the water following the anchor line down, maybe 30 or 40 feet, and ready to go to the surface. He would pull on his line, and his partner on the other end would take the other end of that rope, which had a weight attached to it. Usually it was a big rock. He tied over the or tossed it over the side of the boat that would pull that diver up to the surface. They warm himself up by the fire while his partner goes in the water, and they continue that process. But then they bring in this helmet gear, which is much more efficient. And so they began to helmet dive for abalone in Monterey Bay. But even for these guys, the water was very cold. So these guys learned to be knitters, and they would take wool sweaters and tear them apart, and they'd knit this wool underwear and put on a pair of that, and put on their clothes, put on a big heavy canvas suit, and then attach about 65 pounds of lead weight to the front and back, lead to their shoes, bolt on the helmet, which had a hose attached to it, then go down into the Monterey Bay. In the early days, they would hand pump the air down to the diver. He would go down 30, 40, 50 feet into the Monterey Bay. The deeper he went, the harder it was to pump. In the 1920s, they put air compressors on the boat. So now they're pushing the air down to the diver with a motor. So now the air diver is going down 40, 50, 60, in some cases up to 100 feet into the Monterey Bay. But at that level, you can't stay down there very long, and you can't see anything at that level. So they work their way up very slowly to this 30-foot level, where they'd be down there all day collecting abalone. So here's an exhibit in our museum, the abalone exhibit. You can see here's the early abalone boat, which were actually, these were Portuguese whale boats that they converted to their abalone dive boats. Here's the pump, the hand pump, which was coming from Japan. There was a diving company in Tokyo that was producing this gear strictly for the divers in California. Here is some of that wool underwear that they would wear. Initially, they were making it, but eventually the company in Tokyo began to produce this strictly for the divers here in Monterey. Here's another abalone basket, another mask you see here. Of course, here's the dive helmet that they wear. Canned abalone, which I'll talk about a little bit later here. But this is, and there's an abalone diver, my old friend Roy Hattori right there. It's a wonderful part of the exhibit. By the way, the model was made by a master model maker named Tom Fordham, who was a good friend of mine. He was a beautiful model he made there. So here is also in the museum, this is a mural done by a guy named Ray Troll. Ray Troll is sort of the Picasso, the Rembrandt of the marine science world. He lives in Alaska, and he came down to the Monterey area, I don't know, about 15 years ago or so, maybe a little longer. There's a building in Pacific Grove that's it's the old, initially built in the 1950s, as an old radar building by the golf course, and then it became part of the NOAA took over that building, and in the 80s, early 90s, and they contracted, actually it was in the 90s, and Ray Troll came in and put a mural around that building, which is still there. And I was at the Maritime Museum then, and Ray came into the Maritime Museum, and I worked with him, helped him get photographs for that mural that he put in. And that building has also been in the news lately because there's a group that want to turn it to sort of an art gallery kind of thing, which I think is a great idea, by the way. So, but I want you to pay attention to the face of the diver in the mask here, because here he is right here. That's the same guy. So that's my friend Roy Hattori, you see right there. When he was 18 when this picture was taken, and he was in his early 90s when this picture was taken right here. So I met Roy, oh gosh, maybe 30 years ago, and I asked him how he learned how to do this, and he told me that when he was a young man, and Roy, I might add, he was Nisei. He was born here in Monterey. He is the only diver, only Japanese diver that was born here. All the other divers came from Japan. They came on the contracts, with a couple exceptions, returned to Japan. But Roy was born here in Monterey. So I asked him how he learned to do this. He told me that when he was a young man, he had just graduated from Monterey High School, and his father wanted to get into the abalone business. It was during the Depression, and he had a lot of debts to pay. He thought this would be a good way to make some money, but he had no real experience in this business. But he had some friends who were in it, so he borrowed some equipment, and he takes Roy in a little boat in the middle of the harbor, and he dresses him up in this wool underwear. In fact, Roy's mother knitted this underwear, puts on the heavy canvas suit, attaches 65 pounds of lead weight to his front back. He ties lead to his shoes. He bolts on the helmet. They just kind of tossed him off the side of the boat. Said, "You start running down there." That's how he learned to be an abalone diver. Luckily, the older divers kind of took him under their wing and kind of showed him what to do. That's how he learned to be an abalone diver. Here's an early photograph. This is at Point Lobos of Japanese divers. And you can see, what I love about this picture is you can see by the helmets here that this is all brand new equipment. I can tell because there's no dents in the helmet here. The helmets are clean. Again, so here's the boats, here's the pump. Of course, you see right there. What's interesting to me about the photograph, of course, is that these are all Japanese, with the exception of this guy right here, who's an old Portuguese whaler who went to work for the Japanese company. Kodani had moved his company from Monterey, worked his way around the peninsula, and wandered into Point Lobos one day and said, "Oh, it looks like home." And he built his company out there. He leased the property for a guy named A.M. Allen, and actually A.M. Allen is this guy right here in the helmet, in the hat you see right there. A.M. Allen was a mining engineer who had come to Monterey in the 19th century to run a coal mine out there, but they were producing a pretty low-grade coal, and they weren't making a lot of money. They only wanted to buy their coal, and so the company decided to sell off the property out there. Their plan was to parcel out for homes until they create a little town. But no one was buying any property out there. I mean, nobody wanted to live out there. It was isolated, away from town. Heck with that. I'm not moving out there. And so Alan thought, well, maybe I could do something with this property. So he bought it from his partners. He did go and buy, there were some of the lots were sold, and he went around and bought the lots that were already sold. And he's the guy that preserved it, and he leased it, at least part of it. You've all been out to Point Lobos, so that part where the Whalers Cove, all area, he leased that part out to Kodani's Abalone company, and he watched them operate for about a year, and he said, man, there's money to be made in this business. And so he became a partner with Kodani. He was actually a pretty progressive guy, A.N. Allen right there. So there's the logo for the Point Lobos Canning Company you see right there. I love that. Just one of illustration of the Abalone diver. And then, of course, here is the Point Lobos Company you see right here. Of course, this is the Whalers Cove parking lot now today. You see right there, and there's the cannery they had. So beginning on the turn of the century, they began to can abalone, and they were trying to develop a Western market for it. And so they were cooking them in the can, just as they were cooking sardines, the same way they would steam them in the can, and they're trying to sell it to the local market. But it was, no pun intended, a tough sell. Here is that steamed canned abalone inside that cannery that they were trying to market to the West Coast. Here is a label that they were using for that canned abalone. We have all these images and whatnot in our exhibit here at the museum. But they worked with a chef at the Hotel Del Monte to come up with some recipes that they put on the label for the canned abalone. Mostly salads seem to be a popular thing right there. Because part of this kind of abalone, there were some experiments with it where they were putting lye and things on it, but it just was just difficult to eat at that point. This is a wonderful photograph showing the whole operation from the other side right there. So this we also have in the museum. This is another part of the story. This is what's known as a maiwai. These maiwais are indigenous to the area of Japan where all these divers came from. All these divers pretty much come from the same area of Japan. Anybody who has been to Japan, you know that Japan is broken up into what they call prefects. Prefects are kind of like states. And these guys all come from the Chiba prefecture. If you ever go to Japan, you fly to Narita Airport, you'll land in the Chiba prefecture. And these guys come from an area about 2.5 hours southeast of Tokyo. It's a big, beautiful peninsula known as the Boso, and it's a fishing community, much like Monterey Peninsula. It looks a lot like the Monterey Peninsula. I have been there a number of times, and they fish for all kinds of things, not just abalone. They fish sardine, they fish shrimp, and they fish all kinds of different things there. Even the small whale fishery that operates there to this day. But at the end, this is a tradition that goes back well over 100 years. At the end of a good fishing season, the fishermen would get what they would get is a piece of painted fabric from the owners of the company as kind of a reward, which represent their particular company. And then the fishermen would turn it into these jackets that they would wear to special ceremonies and to temple and special kinds of events. Of course, this one's kind of special because look, here's the American flag, here's the Japanese flag. E-Day and Company, Monterey, USA. I mean, that was from here. We had no idea these even existed till about 15, 20 years ago. We think there was less than 10 of these actually ever made. There are only 2 of them exist today. This one that you see right here, and there's one on exhibit in a museum in Tateyama, Japan, and a permanent exhibit. And this one is on exhibit, I'm proud to say, right now here in Monterey at the JACL Heritage Museum. As far as we know, these never actually came to the United States until I brought this one here. This is something they would have gotten when they actually went back to Japan. E-Day was a partner, by the way, of Noda. So we worked with the Maui maker in Japan, the last, by the way, of the traditional Maui makers in Japan, in a town called Shirahama, where most of these divers lived in this small town. And we worked with him to reproduce that jacket. And so he spent a couple of years and actually these are all hand done, and he reproduced this jacket. You can see how beautiful this one looks, how bright it is. And it's just beautiful. And we also have this on exhibit, but we also use it for educational purposes. The Maui maker actually wrote a whole paper about what he discovered about making this. And you could tell by way how it was designed and the shape of the waves, actually what part of Japan that it came from, and all that kind of thing. So we know that because of the waves, it comes from the Chiba Prefecture because of that. So it's just really a wonderful thing there. So as I mentioned, I've been to that part of Japan many, many times. And the first time I ever went there, I was given this tour of Shirahama, and sort of my counterpart over there is pointing out all the houses. He says, diver house, diver house, diver house. All these houses that divers lived in that came to Monterey well over 100 years ago. Well, for the most part, their families still own these houses. They don't necessarily live in them, but they still own the houses. And so we went to visit them. And the first thing that I saw at every house has this shrine to Monterey. We had no idea these existed until that time. Look at these abalone shells. These are world record size. You could take a bath in that shell. That's how big it is. They came out of Monterey Bay over 100 years ago, well over 100 years ago. This doll was purchased at Home's department store in Pacific Grove in 1927, now a family heirloom. Very important. Here's a close-up of that abalone shell. Of course, the companies there actually was a Japanese company on the Monterey Wharf that was polishing these shells and then selling them to tourists. But they're also doing it at Point Lobos, and then there were other companies, Japanese companies that were doing it as well. So in Shirahama, in that area of Japan, there's a number of abalone pieces that were sent back home, or when the divers returned back to Japan, they would bring these things back, not just abalone shells, but they made all kinds of different jewelry pieces. And I've seen little teacup saucers and things all made out of abalone, just really beautiful kinds of things right there. So here is part of our museum exhibit that we have that shows a number of these abalone pieces that are being sold here to the tourists. This wonderful spoon, all abalone, and it says on what's written on the back. It says abalone spoon. It was purchased at probably Manuel one of the Duarte family businesses in the 1890s. That's what it says on the back of that. Also was an eBay purchase there. Came out of an estate, I believe, in South Carolina. And then the big abalone shell here, beautiful. And this was actually produced by a Japanese company. They also produced the wooden box you see right here, which is made out of cypress. And they made this for the Monterey Chamber of Commerce, presented it as a gift to Henry Metcalf, or to Victor Metcalf. Victor Metcalf in 1908 was the Secretary of the Navy. And then, of course, if you know Monterey history, in 1908, Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, which was on a trip around the world to eventually sail into Tokyo Bay because they were concerned about Japan showing its military might there at that time. Japan had just finished this big war with Russia, and so the United States is a little concerned about this. So Teddy Roosevelt sends his battleship fleet around the world to sail into Tokyo Bay, and along the way they would stop. And they stopped into Monterey. In fact, the Japanese Association I talked about earlier actually was formed to help the city of Monterey raise $100 that helped bring the Great White Fleet to Monterey. So this shell was made as a gift to Victor Metcalf. They actually took it to San Francisco where he was. He didn't come down to Monterey because he was ill, I believe, and they presented it to him. And for reasons I don't understand or don't know why, he never actually took the gift. And so it never actually left San Francisco. It came back to Monterey, where we now have it on exhibit at our JACL Heritage Museum. Here's another more of those sort of abalone artifacts. So there were other companies that began to produce these things that they were selling to tourists, not just in Monterey, but actually all over the United States. There was a company called SLAM, S-A-L-M. They actually operate out of Southern California, and they were producing these abalone artifacts. There was a company, most of the shell, by the way, is from Monterey, but they would come and pick up the shell, and they're producing these things. They actually would cut redwood, and then they would cut the abalone shell and glue it onto the redwood. Of course, you'll see the thermometers. That seemed to be a regular thing. All of them had these little thermometers. And usually there'll be a name of the town that they're selling these things on, like Columbus, Ohio, right? Nothing says Ohio like abalone, don't you think? So this is abalone. Here's some salt and pepper shakers, and of course the hatchets and the lighthouse and the anchors. These are abalone buttons you see right here. All kinds of different little different kinds of knickknacks and things. I love this. This piece right here actually is from the late 1890s World's Fair in Chicago. It was a honor of Christopher Columbus, and it was the Columbus Exposition. And this actually has a painting on it of Christopher Columbus landing in the New World. Of course, it's all abalone. So here's another big player in the story, and we depict the story in our museum. Of course, this is Pop Ernest Dulter, who was a German restaurateur who came to Monterey in 1907 to open a small restaurant on Alvarado Street called the Cafe Ernest. And it was sort of a European-style, Bohemian-style restaurant where people come and spend the whole day, whole evening in the restaurant. Here's an ad for that restaurant. And of course, in those days, his main menu item was oysters, and people ate oysters. The oysters are a very popular food item, not just in Monterey, actually, but all over the United States. And oysters, you don't find out oysters in Monterey. So the oysters had to come from San Francisco. There were oyster farms in San Francisco, and they were sending them down by train. Learning about trains sometimes will get delayed. There'll be a cow in the middle of the track. Trains will break down. And of course, oysters, like almost any shellfish or seafood, really, it won't stay fresh very long. And oftentimes his oyster order will arrive in Monterey, it will be spoiled. And so he was always looking for something new that he could sell in his restaurant. Well, what the Japanese were doing initially, all that abalone, because really, as I mentioned, wasn't a big market for it here. They were drying it, and then they were shipping it back to Japan. Dried abalone in Japan is a very important thing. It's not just as a food item, because you could reconstitute it in water, but also dried abalone represents all kinds of things. Particularly, it's a good luck thing. On New Year's or at weddings, oftentimes you'll see cards with abalone, strips of dried abalone glued into the cards. And so dried abalone is very, very important. And in fact, they were sending the canned product back to Japan, but they didn't want that canned product. They wanted the dried product. So Pop, watching all this dried abalone leaving Monterey, thought, well, maybe I could do something with that. So he brought in this abalone into his restaurant. Here's a photograph of the interior of his Alvarado Street restaurant. And he began to experiment with it. Here's his kitchen right back here. Where he took the abalone, where he took the foot, that's eating abalone, and then he would pound it to make it nice and soft. And you don't just pound it. There's a certain technique to doing that. They go through egg wash, cracker crumbs, and cook it up quickly in olive oil and butter, and created this abalone steak. And soon people came from all over, eat fresh steaks and fresh abalone steaks in Pop's restaurant. Here is a photograph of, again, of the interior of the restaurant. And here is Pop Ernest right here. Then these are his three sons right here. This is, I believe, is Carl. And then this is the son Ernest Jr. And then this is one of his daughters, Vera, that you see right here. And I believe this picture was taken in 1908 when the Great White Fleet was visiting Monterey. You can see the American flag shield symbols on the window right here. I love that right there. So we have that exhibit in our museum. Pop was famous not only for his abalone steaks, but also famous for his abalone stew, which he would serve in the abalone shell. So here it is in the abalone shell, and then abalone, again, salt and pepper shakers. So I worked with the museum in Tateyama, Japan, many years ago, where I was the curator of an exhibit on abalone as food and beauty, and we recreated Pop's restaurant, and we had a Japanese artist make this Japanese style, made Pop's abalone stew that you see right there. All right, and I was able to bring it back here, now have it on exhibit. So people would come from all over into Pop's restaurant, and they would sing songs and write posts like, some folks boast the quail toast because they think it's Tony, but I'm content to owe my rent and live on abalone. This is a page from Pop's guest book from 1913 that was written in his guest books by George Sterling. Here it is right here. Although we don't think George Sterling actually made up that particular stanza of the abalone, what eventually becomes the abalone song. It was actually a woman by the name of Opal Heron that did that. So George Sterling, as you probably all know, was sort of the king of the Bohemians, and he and his wife moved to Carmel after the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. That all their Bohemian friends all came down to visit, and they would go and they would collect abalone on Carmel Beach, and they would pound it, and they would write these little ditties as they're pounding the abalone, and they sort of sang it like a dirge. That's sort of how they did it. And then eventually, I believe in the 1930s, someone added if you sing it to Yankee Doodle Dandy, then it all comes out. But the Ernest family still has these guest books. There are literally hundreds of these in that guest book you see right there. In 1913, I won't go into the whole history of this, but in 1913, Pop left Monterey. He was offered a better job in San Francisco to bring abalone recipes to San Francisco. It offered so much money, he had no option. In fact, it was a restaurant called the Hofbrau, which is on the corner of Market and 4th Street, in a big building called the Pacific Building. The building is actually still there today. If you go there today, there was a Nordstrom's in there, and there's a movie complex in the top floors. And down below in the basement is a big, giant food court. That's exactly where the Hofbrau restaurant was. And you can see glued on the bottom of that menu, here's abalone specials, abalone cocktail, 25 cents, abalone salad, abalone nectar in a cup, hot or cold. That's just the juice that came out of the shell. Abalone a la Ernest, that's Pop Ernest style with that's breaded, and that's and like the abalone steaks. Of course, he was treating it like you would treat a Wiener Schnitzel. It's exactly how he prepared it right there. And this is an ad that would appear in the San Francisco Chronicle at least once a month. Wholesomest shellfish is the abalone. Clings to the rocks and feeds on seaweed mosses. We get them daily by express direct from Point Lobos, Carmel Bay. Packed in seaweed, they arrive here not only fresh, but alive and kicking. If you want a new gastronomic sensation, visit the Hofbrau. We're still, no pun intended, a tough sell. And they're getting all the abalone, as I mentioned, he had from Monterey. It was mostly coming from Point Lobos Canning Company. And again, shellfish doesn't stay fresh that long. And oftentimes it would get to San Francisco and it would be spoiled. What happens, of course, is in 1915, the World's Fair comes to San Francisco. It was called the Panama Pacific International Exposition. It was a World's Fair to honor the Panama Canal. It opened a couple of years before. You've all been to San Francisco. The Palace of Fine Arts was built for that World's Fair. The whole area of San Francisco was just a big mud flat, and they all filled it in for this World's Fair, about 600 acres. And all kinds of new products are introduced at this World's Fair, new cars and bicycles and motorcycles and food products, all kinds of different contraptions. Every state was represented. Every state had its own special building. California had the largest of the state buildings. It was 5 acres in size. Within that California state building, every county was represented. And Monterey County had one of the largest exhibits in that building. And let's take a look at the Monterey County exhibit. At least part of it here is Monterey, the Mission County. But what is the first thing you notice? Look, your abalone diver in the case right there in the exhibit, and you can see all the little our little ocean view here. Let's take another view of it. Here's from behind. Again, you can see our abalone diver here, and look at all the abalone shells that you see here. So there are actually about 7 varieties of abalone in California, and all of them represented in this photograph that they had at the World's Fair here. And anybody who remembers the old Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History, when I was a kid, you go to the museum in Pacific Grove, when we went to the main room, there was a big exhibit of undersea under the Monterey Bay. Well, here it is. This is where they got it. It was built for this World's Fair. When the World's Fair was over, they transferred over to the Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History that you see right there. So Point Lobos had its own booth at that World's Fair, and they were giving away this canned abalone as souvenirs to the visitors of the fair, and sending folks down to the Hofbrau for full abalone dinners. And soon the whole world wanted this new sensation, abalone. Hotels, restaurants, all wanted it. They couldn't get enough of it. Pop says there's money to be made here. So he quits the Hofbrau restaurant and he moves just about a block away up onto Bush Street, and he opens this restaurant where first time they ever call it Pop Ernest, a place to eat morning, noon, and night, specialized on seafood, game, and poultry, big, deep sea mussels as not known before in San Francisco, exclusive in red, abalone a la Ernest, in various solid and liquid forms. Well, this restaurant lasted just about a year. It was really catered to the businessmen of San Francisco. That's how I was trying to market this as a sort of a lunch, a power lunch kind of thing. But this was later on, 1916, 1917. The war in Europe was going on. There was a lot of anti-German sentiment in the United States at this point. And so Pop closed the restaurant. And he moved back to Monterey, packed up his family, packed up his abalone recipes. He actually goes out and partners with A.M. Allen and Janosuke Kadani, who lives at Point Lobos, and he begins to create abalone steak. If you've been to Point Lobos, there's the Whalers Cabin Museum. He was in that building where he set sort of an assembly line of Japanese ladies pounding abalone. They were preparing it, and then they were shipping it to San Francisco and selling it. Pop's wife actually lived in San Francisco for a period, working as a broker, brokering abalone steaks to restaurants and hotels in Northern California. And in 1919, he goes down to the Monterey Wharf, and he opens the very first restaurant on the Monterey Wharf. Here it is here. It was actually in the old Monterey Yacht Club. So he initially called the restaurant the Club because it was already marked the Club. So why change the name? That didn't last very long. He eventually went to Pop Ernest. But here he is here, and again, one of his sons here. And then, of course, and this is early restaurant. He opened this restaurant in May of 1919. This was probably taken about that time when they opened that restaurant right there. This is the salmon boat in Monterey. This is the Ohio #2. This is a Japanese family. This is the Manaka family, actually. One of their salmon boats you see right there. And that's Frank Manaka there. Frank Manaka, another one of my heroes in the world. And Frank family moved to Monterey in 1906 to be salmon fishermen. In fact, Frank's father also worked at Pop Ernest's restaurant as a cook for a period when he wasn't fishing. Frank was born about 1906 in San Francisco. The family moved to Monterey. He grew up here, went to Monterey schools, Of course, Monterey is a very small town. It was then, and it is still today. So everybody lived together. They all lived next door to each other. They all knew each other. He went to Monterey schools, to Monterey High School, and played on the Monterey High School baseball team, wanted to be a pitcher. He told me anyway, he was a good pitcher, and I believe that he was. He had the opportunity to see Joe DiMaggio come to Monterey and pitch right across the street from where I am right now in the Jack's ballpark. And Frank said to me, he says, Tim, if Joe DiMaggio, the son of a fisherman, can be a baseball player, the Frank Monaca, the son of a fisherman, can be a baseball player. And Frank's dad said, no, you're going to be a fisherman. So when Frank graduated from high school in 1918 or 1928, he got his first boat. Here he is on his bridge of his brand new purse seiner. That's a type of sardine boat that he had, that was the first type of netting that he had, called the Ohio No. 3. And that was a big boat. In fact, Frank is the first Japanese American, all of California, to get one of these boats. And those boats in 1928 could have cost up to $30,000. So Frank, where'd you guys get the money? They were not a wealthy family. He said there was an engine company up in San Francisco called the Enterprise Engine Company, and just designed this brand new kind of experimental diesel engine. Came down to Monterey. Said, anybody willing to put our engine to your boat, we'll carry the note for you. Frank is the only guy that raised his hand. So here is the Ohio No. 3 with a deck load of fish right there. And then Frank's crew that you see out here. And then here's a model we have at our museum of the Ohio No. 3 that you see right there. I love this model. And this was made by another master model maker in Monterey named Mike Croft. And Mike actually worked with Frank. He wrote letters back and forth. Frank was living in Southern California at that point. And to get the details correct, I got to make sure that the paint was correct. All the details you see on the boat were absolutely accurate. I worked with Frank quite a bit as well. And Frank's dream was to live to be 100. And he made it. He got to be 100, and then he died about 2 weeks after that. But he is truly one of my heroes. And here's a whole exhibit panel about Frank you see right there. So this is a list of Japanese fishermen. We think of the sardine fishery as being a Sicilian fishery, and it really was a Sicilian fishery. They were the majority of that fishing, of the sardine fishery. But was forgotten is a number of these guys who were fishing sardine in Monterey were Japanese fishermen. And this is a list from Union, from Southern California, of Japanese fishermen that were coming up to Monterey to fish sardine here. In Monterey, the sardine season would go from August 1st to February 15th. In Southern California was another large sardine fishery would go from October all the way into April. So a number of these Japanese fishermen would come up from Southern California to fish sardine in Monterey, and starting in August, and then they wouldn't go back down. They could fish all the way almost a whole year doing it that way. But what's interesting to me is Monterey is the only place that I can find, only place where the fishermen had one union. In Northern California, in Southern California, all the ethnic groups had separate unions, and you can see that by the fact that this list is broken up just by the fact they were Japanese. But Monterey just had one union. I think primarily because Monterey is a small town. These guys all grew up together. They all played together. They all went to school together. But the real key, these boys all played baseball together. It was not uncommon for these young Japanese boys to learn to speak some Italian before they learned to speak English, and those Italian boys who learned to speak some Japanese before they learned to speak English. So I believe Monterey is the only place that I can find where that kind of thing happened, was right here. So here is Frank Monaca on again. This is a later boat that he had called the Western Explorer. This is a deck load of sardines on that boat there. With a guy standing knee deep in sardines right there. So this is the Monterey Canning Company. This was A.M. Allen's company. It was Kadani's partner at the Point Lobos Canning Company. They they got into the sardine business, opened this beautiful cannery on Cannery Row. This is the cannery itself, what they call mission style architecture right here. This building is no longer there. It's burned down a couple of times actually, but the warehouse is still there. If you go down Cannery Row, you'll see it. It's the red building, the corrugated building, and looks just like this right there. Of course, Alan employed a lot of Japanese workers in his cannery. This is Mr. Oda. Mr. Oda, whose grandson, Larry Oda, who lives in Monterey. Larry was at one time the national president of the Japanese American Citizen League, and also now on the board of directors here in Monterey, Japanese American Citizen League. His grandfather and father are both in the fishing business. Larry's father actually managed a cooperative abalone processing plant on the Monterey Wharf. And his grandfather actually opened a sardine cannery on Cannery Row. In fact, it was the only completely Japanese-owned cannery on Cannery Row. Here it is, the Sea Pride Packing Corporation. And if you know the Monterey Cannery Row and the Monterey Aquarium, this here would be where the Monterey Aquarium deep sea exhibits are today. So in the aquarium world, the canneries are on the ocean side and the warehouses are on the other side. And once all the fishermen can, they go by conveyor belt across this thing called the crossover into the warehouse. And Sea Pride was opened in 1926, and they can abalone, salmon, squid, sardine, and then for 1 year they canned this product you see right here. So there was a whale fishery in Moss Landing called California Sea Products, which is a Norwegian company, and they operated in Moss Landing from 1919 to 1926. And for that 1 year in 1926, they were shipping the tail of the whale over to Sea Pride where they were canning it. And I've had the label translated, and essentially what it says is it's packed in soy sauce, and it's delicious. What we don't know is where was it going? Were they shipping us to Japanese communities here in California, Oregon, Washington? Were they shipping it to Japan? I've given the label to Japanese historians that I know. The Japanese keep a really good record, but they had never seen it, so we don't know. But I actually found the label glued on the bottom and the back of one of Papa Ernest's restaurant guest books. That's where it came from, which leads me to believe that he was probably serving this at one point in his restaurant in 1926. Probably was serving it in a salad, would be my guess. That's how he was doing it then. So here's the Japanese crew in one of the sardine canneries. This is the San Xavier Cannery, which was very important also to Japanese communities. Employed a lot of Japanese workers in these canneries. These are all fish cutters. They had that particular skill to do that. And of course, this guy has a cool tattoo right there too. So the unions came into the cannery for the workers in 1938. The fishermen were unionized almost from the jump, but the cannery workers were not. Finally, were unionized by the American Federation of Labor in 1938. And if you know about unions, of course, or anybody's a union member out there, you pay your dues at least once a month. You pay your dues, and someone from the union will come in and stamp that you paid your dues that month. This is a union book for a Mr. Sato, a Japanese worker in the canneries. And if you look at this little book tells a big story. If you look at the book, so he paid his dues here January 23rd, 1941, and then it's stamped. Then look, he withdraws from the union. He paid again in February, then he withdraws from the union in March of 1941. And he withdrew because he got drafted into the Army. And then the United States went to war in 1941, after December 1941. And he became, Mr. Sato did, he became a member of the 442nd, which is the most highly decorated unit in the United States Army in World War II, all Japanese unit. And he was in the Army, and then he returned in October of 1945, went right back to work in the canneries where he paid his union dues again. And there it is. So look, it's all blank from 1941 until 1945, where after he came back from the Army and paid, but a little book pays a big role. And I actually, another this is another thing that I found on eBay. All right. So sports, as I mentioned, were very important to the Japanese community, baseball in particular. The Minatos, this was a baseball team that was sponsored by Monterey Japanese American Citizens League. Minato essentially translates to meaning small harbor. It again was sponsored mainly by a Japanese businessman, a Japanese who were associated with the fishing industry, and this is a guy named Kai Miyamoto. He was quite a baseball player. I've been told he was kind of like the Babe Ruth of his time. He was quite an athlete, actually. You can see other trophies that we have, basketball trophies and track trophies that we have. Here is a photograph of Monterey Japanese community playing in a baseball tournament against the Salinas Japanese community and the Watsonville Japanese community. This is from 1926. And you can see this was taken in Watsonville. And I can tell you that the Monterey actually won this tournament. I don't remember the score, but I know that Monterey actually won the tournament right there. And then here is a photograph from our museum. Alameda Kono. This was a team of Japanese American baseball boys who from Northern California, who in 1936 went to Japan and also went to China to play baseball. And Kai Miyamoto was one of those boys that got to go. And this is his uniform from that time. As far as I know, this is the only one that still exists today. We have it on exhibit. We also have scrapbooks that we recently received about this trip and baseballs that were played in Japan and China from these tournaments. So it's really a nice thing. All right, so this is a great photograph taken in 1936 of Japanese community, JACL, pulling their American flag in the Monterey 4th of July parade. This was built by the women of the JCL. This was built right across the street in the baseball park. And they was asked why they built such a large flag. And they said, you know, we built this flag because only a few people could ride on a float, but it takes 60 people to carry this flag. And they carried this in a number of 4th of July parades here in Monterey. I'm happy to say that the flag still exists today. It's unfortunately not here in Monterey anymore, but it is now part of the collection of the Japanese American Museum, National Museum in Los Angeles. It's in their collection today, but unfortunately it's too large to be exhibited, but they do have it and they're taking good care of it. So I'm happy to know that it's still there. So another stuff that we do exhibit, we tell this story. This is an important story. So when it was announced that Japanese were returning from these concentration camps in 1945, there was actually a push to stop the Japanese from returning to the West Coast, especially here on the West Coast, coming from the Monterey area, coming from a group in Salinas, part of the Monterey Salinas Growers Shippers Association. And they really was about land, what it was all about. And they actually put an ad in the local Monterey Herald trying to get folks to sign on to their petition to stop the Japanese from returning to California. Well, there was folks in Monterey who were incensed about this. In particular, one by the name of Tony Jackson. Tony Jackson was then the live-in girlfriend of Ed Ricketts. Ed Ricketts, the famous Doc Ricketts from Cannon Road. Ed Ricketts was John Steinbeck's best friend at that time. Tony was a pretty progressive thinker for her time. She was incensed, just really upset about this push to try to stop the Japanese. These were her friends. She knew these people. And so she created this petition drive that went all around the Monterey Peninsula. And they gathered about 500, 600 people signed these petitions. They did it rather quickly. A lot of well-known people. This particular one, which was done at Ed Ricketts' lab, was actually signed by, here's Tony. He's actually signed at Tony Ricketts. But there's Ed Ricketts' name underneath there. John Steinbeck signed it down here in pencil. but you'll see Robinson Jeffers and others folks sign these petitions, and we thought these petitions were long gone, and they were really demanding that the Japanese receive their full democratic rights as American citizens. That's what they were demanding, and they turned these over to the Monterey Herald, and the Monterey Herald actually ran a big full-page ad that appeared in the Monterey Herald in May of 1945 that the Japanese who were returning to Monterey received their democratic rights. And so, as far as we know, this is the only place this happened, was here in Monterey. This is it. No, it didn't happen anywhere else but here. And we knew about these petitions, but we thought they were long gone. We thought they just long disappeared. And then in 2013, I was actually doing some work at the JACL Hall and going through some old files, and I actually found these petitions. And so there are about 15 of them in total. And we have a whole exhibit about this, and we just completed, it's been several years in the making, but we just completed a documentary film about all of this as well, that we will be showing for in April. We're in conjunction with the Monterey Library. We're going to show it here at the JACL Hall. All right. And so just to wrap this up, here's one of my favorite exhibits in the museum, is this wonderful chair. This is what I call the seat of Monterey history right here. This tree is made of oak, supposedly from the same oak that Sebastian Discaino in 1602 and Winifred Serra in 1770 all held mass under when they first arrived in Monterey. And if you all know that story, if you all live in Monterey for any length of time, you'll know that story, that they all slowly held mass under this great oak tree, which would have been about the base of the entrance to the Presidio. That's where it would have been. And I won't go into the whole history of the tree, but essentially, oaks live a very long time. But essentially, the oak was hit by lightning in the 1850s, caused a lot of damage, but it continued to live. But in the 1890s, the city of Monterey was doing some trenching work in that area to put in a new sewage system, and they cut its roots, and it actually killed the tree, and it died. And but I kept it there. It was very important to the local priest at the San Carlos Cathedral, Father Mestres, and so he put a little fence around it and things, tried to protect it. And then in 1906, James Stanford donated to the city of Monterey this big concrete granite sculpture of Winifred Serra on a boat. You've probably all seen it. It's at the top of the Presidio Hill today. You see it up there, although initially it was supposed to be down below. And so the city of Monterey sent a crew to clamp that piece of property so they could put the statue in, take the fence down, whatnot, which they did. Then they just took the tree and tossed it into the bay because it was dead. Hey, so Father Mestres heard about this. He was very upset. So he went to his congregation, which then made up of a number of Portuguese whalers, and said, could you go out and see if you could find the tree? And so these whalers went out in their whaleboat, found the tree. It was floating about 25 miles out in the bay out there. And this is the best part. They harpooned it, and they pulled it back to Monterey, where they actually set it up. Partly, there's a part of it set up, I believe you can still see it behind the San Carlos Cathedral, but then there are all these loose pieces of it. And so a guy by the name of Harry Green, who was a very important guy in Monterey, and I won't go into the history of Harry Green, but Harry was a lover of trees. Harry really was responsible for Arbor Day. He used to be known as Tin Can Harry because he used to give away tree saplings in tin cans. Well, he went to his friend Otto Subaru Noda, Noda's cannery. He said, do you think you could do something with these loose pieces of this oak tree? Maybe we could make some things, the souvenirs and different things. So Noda thought for a minute. He went to his nephew, a young man named Ichiro Noda. Ichiro Noda had come to Monterey to work for his uncle when Ichiro was about 15. When he got to California, Ichiro still didn't speak English. So his uncle sent him to school, went to Pacific Grove High School. It was Pacific Grove Grammar School, it was called then, and it was small. And so they recruited him to be a member of Pacific Grove High School football team. And here's a photograph of Ichiro Noda right here on the Pacific Grove High School football team. As far as I know, Ichiro Noda is the first Japanese national to play American football in the United States. and Pacific, and there he is right there. So he took those branches and produced those chairs. In fact, he made 3 of them. Here is the one I just showed you. Here it is right here on exhibit at the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco in the Monterey County exhibit. In fact, here's our Abalone diver. Look right here, and here's that chair right here in 1915. Harry Green made the chairs and gave them to the Native Sons of the Golden West, which is a fraternal organization that's still around today. I believe Harry was a member of that organization. And they were at the Custom House then. And Ichiro actually left Monterey about 1909 and went to New York. We went to NYU, got a degree. Then he opened a concession at Coney Island that he ran for a number of years. He was very successful, actually made a lot of money. And he went back to Japan to visit. And while he was in Japan, World War II broke out and he couldn't leave Japan. He stayed, he was older at that point, and he stayed until the early 60s. He wanted to go back to visit. So he came back to California, came here to Monterey, and his one dream was to see these chairs. He talks about these chairs all of his life. He told his family about them. That's all they heard about were these chairs. He was so proud of them that he had made these chairs and for this American organization. And so they looked frantically all over Monterey. They couldn't find them. They never saw them. They didn't know what happened to them until State Parks found this one that I now have on exhibit at our Japanese American Museum here at JACL Hall. I think we probably found it in the Custom House. The other 2, we don't know what happened to them. They're long gone. But this one they had, but even State Parks didn't know its history until I told them. So they now have the history of it that was made by a Japanese fisherman. And then here it is, the 2 chairs. But this is the same chair that's on exhibit at the Panama Pacific. You see right there. And then this is the original artwork for a new mural that we just put in at our museum. Here's the museum right here, this Intertour Museum here, this wonderful new mural that we have. And of course, that's an abalone boat that's being pulled into Monterey. That's what they showed a photograph. And then starting in the next couple of weeks, we're putting a brand new Japanese garden that'll be right in front of that there. And I think that I bored you all enough. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you for all that information. That was great. At this moment, if anyone from the audience has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask Tim. Or if you'd like, you can type them into the chat and I will read them out loud. So some messages in the chat. Fabulous talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Learned a lot.
I appreciate that. By the way, I should mention that the museum is open now on the weekends. Not every weekend, but it will be open this weekend on Sunday and Saturday as well. We're actually having a talk on Saturday. We're working with the Monterey Association as a book talk here with a gentleman who's actually of Russian descent, but his family escaped Russia in the 1920s and moved to Japan and actually lived in Hiroshima and lived through the bombing of Hiroshima. And he wrote a book about his mother in particular. And he's going to here to talk about his mother and his family experience. And the museum will be open Saturday afternoon, and it'll also be open Sunday mornings at 11. And I'll be here on Sunday to take people through the museum if anybody has any questions.
We got one question in the chat. How long is an abalone season would be available for the Japanese fishermen?
So the seasons would change from year to year, but they usually are pretty long, and they would be anywhere from 9 to 10 months sometimes.
And why the Japanese fishermen stopped the abalone industry?
Well, they changed quite a bit. In particular, of course, World War II was a big issue there. That stopped it completely at that point. I should point out that because of abalone and because of Pop's recipe in particular, there becomes such a demand for this product. because other people began to produce it, abalone steaks, that kind of thing. Prior to World War II, 80% of the businesses on the wharf were Japanese-owned businesses, abalone processors and fish markets, and by the end of the war, there weren't a lot more. The abalone population had changed, in part because there was no control over the fishery at all during World War II. The Fish and Game, which did try to control it, most of the Fish and Game folks were in the war. They were gone. There was just no control of it. And then in the late 1940s, a guy you all may have heard of, a guy by the name of Jacques Cousteau, invented the aqualung. And everybody go out and get abalone. And soon everybody's out there getting it, and that's what happened to the abalone. So I blame Jacques Cousteau for the demise of the abalone.
Thank you. Where was Pop Ernst's first Monterey restaurant?
So it was on Alvarado Street, roughly where if you go down Alvarado Street today, there's a ice cream place there now. I can't think of the name, but there's ice cream, and there's a clothing store area there. It's right next to the old bank. That's an antique thing now, but that's where it was on Alvarado Street.
Revival Ice Cream.
Revival Ice Cream, yeah.
Yes. And what were the hours of the museum? Someone's asking about the information.
So on Sunday, it will open at 11, and it'll probably open till 2 o'clock or so. I have to close a little early because taiko drummers come and practice on Sunday sometimes. They're going to be here this Sunday, and they're very loud.
Yes, they are. All right. Does anyone else have any questions before we wrap this up?
Well, I appreciate everybody, and then just next month, we're going to talk about Pat Hathaway's collection with James Terry and Ken Seavey. James Terry is the director of the Monterey County Historical Society, and who now has that wonderful collection. And Ken Seavey is a good friend of mine, local historian, who's the guy responsible for getting it there. So that should be fun.
Thank you, Tim. Yep, we will be talking to them next month. And also, I just wanted to let everyone know that on Tuesday, we will be having Susan Schillinglaw and directors from the San Jose State University John Steinbeck group, who will be talking and celebrating John Steinbeck's 120th birthday. So that will be on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday. So if you're interested, please feel free to register at the Monterey Public Library website. And this recording of this program will be on the Monterey Public Library's YouTube page. So that should be up within the next week or so. So if you want to revisit it again. Tim, thank you very much for another amazing program. And thank you all for taking some time to join us.